All right, all right. Let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Casey Dunning-Davis. I'm the U.S. Policy Director at the Energy for Growth Hub, which is a think tank focused on energy abundance for jobs and growth in emerging markets. And I'm so pleased you're here. We have an excellent panel for you today. One quick programming note, one of our panelists, Inde Cisse, unfortunately had some family issues and is not able to join us, but fear not, we have a great panel for you here. So let me introduce, we have Moussa Blimpo, Assistant Professor at the University of Toronto and a Fellow at the Energy for Growth Hub. We have Mr. Charles Mensah, Founder and Chairman of the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Jude Moore, former Minister of Public Works of Liberia and Distinguished Fellow at the Energy for Growth Hub, so also a dynamite West African panel as well. I want to start with a very brief scene setter before turning to our panelists. A recent study of constraints to growth analyses and diagnostics from the last 20 years around the globe found that fully half listed energy as the binding constraint to growth. This was the sector that was found to be binding the most. It topped out access to finance, to a poor business environment, to tax policy. It was energy. If you couple that with the most recent World Bank Enterprise Survey in Sub-Saharan Africa, which, as you all know, surveys top firms in 37 countries, the biggest obstacle was found to be #1, tax rates, and right on its heels, #2, again, power. So from both a growth perspective and both a firm perspective, energy is the constraint. And we've also heard this in the summit. Yesterday, many of the high growth firms we heard about were in energy hungry sectors, and there was a direct causation between those firms and where there was energy supply. And we also heard about the macro effects of energy debt and its impact on stability, some issues that I hope we can come to later in the panel. So with that, I'm so excited to have the chance to dive deep on energy and growth, and I'm gonna turn to our panel. So Jude, I would love to start with you. The panel believes energy is the key, or at least necessary, to growth. But what would you tell policymakers, our audience who are dealing with live questions of where to invest finite resources? How do you think about energy to unlock growth?
Thank you, Casey, and morning, well, yes, afternoon. And everybody, it's a pleasure to be here. I thought yesterday was incredible. Thank you, Joe, for your presentation. I think I would like to start with something you mentioned, growth diagnostics, because by the time I came into government in Liberia, the country had been at war for about 14 years. So all of its infrastructure was destroyed. By 2003, there was no energy infrastructure in Liberia. And the way we saw, at least under President Sirleaf, the way we saw power was a demonstration of legitimacy of the state, that the state could provide service for its people after 14 years of war. However, in that time, we also wanted an MCC compact because we wanted significant grant to help relieve some of the constraints to growth. And so with the MCC process, there has to be a diagnostic, a growth diagnostic, a constraints analysis. What is the binding constraint to economic growth in the country? And for us in Liberia, we initially said, we don't need a constraints analysis. We know it's roads. We need more roads in the country because it rains. And MCC was like, okay, no problem. If you say it's roads, let's do the growth diagnostic. And if roads is the binding constraint, it will find it to be the binding constraint. In the end, roads featured on a binding constraint, but it was really power. And so for a country emerging from war, with everything destroyed, I was attempting to rebuild its system. without power, outside of just social services to be able to drive economic growth, without power, there was nothing that we could do in Liberia. So on the question of, where to invest finite resources, obviously I would say power. If you'd asked me then, I would have said roads. But I think power. And when we thought about infrastructure and where to deploy finite and hard to get capital, one has to think that, well, at the end of a civil war, every single thing is a priority. And so you have to make a list of priorities, and then you have to have priorities of those priorities. So one of the things we thought to do was that when we invested in infrastructure or power, any form of infrastructure, one of the first things we tried to target was that the investment should impact the largest numbers of people. So if there were 3 roads to be built, the road that connected the largest population centers would take priority. If we had to build a line, a transmission line, then we're building transmission lines between the places with the most people. The second thing, and that was important, was to target an ecosystem. So if we are building a transmission line, are we building a transmission line in the part of the country that produces the most rubber, so that you can be able to add value to rubber? So by thinking about it in investing, deploying capital in an ecosystem way of thinking about things, it helps with how it was deployed. But in the end, and later I can go into that idea of focusing on connections over the productive use of power would come back to bite us.
Excellent teaser. I definitely want to come back to that. Moussa, I'd love to bring you in here and get your thoughts on why a government should focus on energy if the goal is growth.
Okay, so first of all, great to be here in Morocco, and thanks to the organizers for putting this Growth Summit together, and to the Energy for Growth Hub for bringing us together to think about these issues. So the way I think about it may sound a little bit academic, but that's how I organize my thought to convince myself of the centrality of energy and electricity in this case. So it's centered around 2 points, 2 observations. The first is that it's undeniable that electricity is not just a sector like other sectors. It has a particularity as an enabler of a lot of other sectors for productivity gains. So another way to think about it in short is that it can be thought of as general purpose technology, a little bit like the steam engine. So it has a potentially transformative effect, not on its own, but as an enabler for a lot of other things that we want to do in order to have a fighting chance for economic growth. That's the first observation. The second observation is, what do we know about economic growth? We are at a growth summit here, but this is not the first time people are gathered to think about growth. In fact, most of the history of development has been around economic growth, right? So I would refer people to the Barcelona Consensus 2004, and the Commission on Growth that was led by Michael Spence in 2008, that tried to gather all the heavyweight, including all the Nobel laureate on economic growth, to tell us what we know about growth. And what we know about growth is that we learn a bunch of necessary conditions, but that there is no recipe. Bob Solow is quoted even saying that growth, even after the fact, is mysterious to explain. Just go ask people to explain to you what drove South Korea's growth or China's growth, and then just wait a little bit, you're gonna get a bunch of different explanations. So if we are acting under uncertainty, we don't know what is going to drive growth, therefore, giving yourself a fighting chance in so many different sectors become as far as I'm concerned, the optimal strategy. So if I am to prioritize of all the necessary conditions, this is not to argue that, okay, if you have electricity, if you have energy, then you get everything done. But if I want to give myself a fighting chance over the next decade, over the next 2 decades, and when it comes to infrastructure investment, yes, I will prioritize those that will increase this chance in so many different sectors because I don't know which sector is going to pick up. We were shown this morning all these different trade success stories. These are not things that are planned, like smart people sit and say, okay, we're going to pick this and do. After the fact, you can make all that story and sound like the smartest person, but it doesn't work like that. So therefore, when it comes to infrastructure investment, to me, it makes sense that if you can prioritize, government have to deal with a lot of things, but you can still prioritize. And to prioritize, for me, means give yourself the most fighting chance of achieving economic growth over the next 1, 2, 3 decades. And that's the way I think about it. And energy, in that case, takes centrality.
That's fantastic. And I do want to come back to kind of the prioritization because obviously that implies trade-offs. You set the scene for energy, but now I want to drill down even further and talk about energy for what? Energy for who? So, Mr. Mensah, I would love to get your take on energy needs for industry. You ran Ghana's aluminum smelter for many years. It was the largest energy consumer, but you were sharing at one point it was running at 20% capacity entirely due to high cost of power. What do power constraints mean for industrial policy, for industrial ambition in a country?
Let me thank you and Todd and the organization for inviting me here. I'll just go straight to the point and then share my own personal experience and how that connects to economic growth and energy. Now, VALCO, or let me put it this way, before Ghana's independence, we didn't have a major electricity generating plant. We were just doing small plants here and there for energy. Then came Kwame Nkrumah and independence in 1957, and the first major act was to get the Akosombo electric dam manufactured, set up by Kaiser engineers of Pittsburgh and Impregilo from Italy. Kaiser engineers designed an electric dam and Impregilo constructed it, and that gave the fighting chance to Ghana to set up an aluminum smelter. In fact, the causation could be said to be the other way. How are we going to grow this economy? We're now independent. We live on cocoa. How are we going to industrialize? Then the idea came that, look, for years, the British has been thinking of industrialization. We have more than 1 billion tons of bauxite. In fact, more than 2 billion, one in Ashanti region, one in the western region, and another in the eastern region. But you cannot industrialize, you cannot go forward without electricity. So then came this big dam, Akosombo Dam, the largest man-made lake at that time in the world. To do what? To generate electricity, to spark industrialization. Now, once the dam was built, the smelter that I ran came on board. But before the smelter, as soon as we got electricity, the government started what we call the Ghana Industrial Holding Corporation. We call it GIHOC. Now, GIHOC became the springboard for Ghana's industrialization, where machine tool firms, different sorts of companies, industrial companies, were all within GEOC. GEOC was about 15 companies. And then what next? The aluminum smelter was also born, 1964. It had capacity to produce 200,000 tons of ingots. Now, the 200,000 tons, the aim was to build the smelter first and then add value to the ingots. We're going to make transmission wires to carry electricity from Akosombo all over the country. Instead of importing transmission wires, we were going to make aluminum to manufacture these transmission wires. We were also going to make aluminum to make car wheels, going to make aluminum to make engine blocks. We're going to make aluminum to make auto parts. That was all set up. Our capacity at the time was 200,000 tons. We were consuming about 80% of the electricity generated. The other 20% went to the GEOC industrial, the industrial company. The remainder was for households. Now, let's go 30 years later. Our politicians have managed to show a preference for household voters instead of industrialization. They've taken all the power from the smelter and given it to households who use it to watch all my children, the English Premier League football, General Hospital. So we spend all our energy watching all my children, and we have closed down the smelter. So from 100%, we're now operating at about 15%. And out of 2,500 workers, we have reduced the workers to 800. All of them gone home, waiting for the day when we'll have enough electricity to take care of households and before industrialization. So industrialization has been put on hold in order for households to watch the English Premier League. That's what is happening now. Should I stop here?
Yes, and I really appreciate you as well, painting a vivid picture, but also highlighting the massive decrease in jobs as well, because I think we talk about industry, but those are real jobs and real people, and the number went down. And I also appreciate the kind of talk about value addition, and so how it's not just how energy inhibits exponential growth and value addition. Right now, though, I'd love to come and carry on with the firms versus households, because you raised a critical issue, which is that we can do what's right for growth, but politicians have many masters. Growth is one of them. The electorate, getting elected again. And so I wondered, actually, I would love to hear from each of you how you think about the firms versus household with the political legitimacy at play, and how you see the balance towards growth versus responding. Do you want to start? Yes.
You know, not only did VACO shut down, or we've been brought down to 15% capacity, GEOC, which is the Ghana Industrial Holding Company, It's all gone. They've all been laid off. Company dead. We had a Bosso glass factory also closed down. Several companies had been closed down because politicians prefer voters. And in my company, most of my friends say, you see what democracy has done to us. And inadvertently, my institute started with the push for democracy in 1992. We were the champions. We didn't know that democracy was going to close our factories. So now people see me and say, aha, you deserve it. You deserve exactly what you got. You came here talking about democracy, people should vote. Well, they showed you what they wanted. They want to watch EPL, English Premier League. But that's what has happened. That's what has happened to us. Gihok lost all its little subsidiaries of about 15. Vaco, we've lost about 2,000 workers. Other companies have done the same. And there were companies built based on the back of Valco. The whole Akosombo town, the township, is almost gone. Tema Township, almost gone. Villages that produced little things that supplied inputs into the smelter are all gone. The blacksmiths around us, the laundries around us, the little banks around us, all those little companies have all vanished. And it's sad. Energy, we all realize the importance of energy now, but sometimes we say it's a little too late.
Oh, and thank you for highlighting those trade-offs. Jude, firms versus households, and bring in the political element that you experienced personally.
Well, we have to win elections, and to be in a position to govern, you have to win elections, and I think. So I'll make specific comments on Liberia and then try to make general comments, because Liberia is such a unique case. Because as I noted, if you come to the end of a decade and a half of war in which the state provided absolutely no service to people, there was no benefit from being a citizen, that you saw especially, in fact, the further away you were from the capital, the lighter the footprint of the state, and you saw absolutely nothing. So when President Sirleaf, the first energy investment in Liberia was 2 megawatts, and 2 megawatts, there are some hotels that use more than 2 megawatts, but the entire country had 2 megawatts. And when she turned on the 2 megawatts, it connected a couple of street lights, a hospital, and her speech was, small light today, big light tomorrow. But one has to realize that in the decade and a half of war, the rest of the world went on. So you have now kids who were born during the war. They're 15 years old and they've never had the experience of flipping on the switch and seeing power, or turning the faucet and seeing water running. And so the primary responsibility of the state at the time was to demonstrate the peace dividend. Well, I have this, when I talk about China and Africa, one of the things that I say is that it seems counterintuitive, but the more democratic a country becomes, the closer it gets to China. And the reason is because across the continent, when we run for office, the thing we promise voting publics across the continent is we'll build infrastructure. And so when you get elected, you turn to the partner who's most likely to help you build the infrastructure for your people. And China, for the last 2 decades, at the very least, has been the partner most capable of doing that. So I can see the tension between providing for firms and for households. But at least from our experience in Liberia, was that the concentration on providing connections. The final benefit of connections is also Every year, second Monday in January, the president goes before Congress, not Congress, legislature, and gives a speech. Americans call it the State of the Union. For us, it's called the annual message. And for us, it was important for the president to announce, over the last 365 days, we made 100,000 connections. That sounds amazing, right? And that stuff helps you win election. It may not turn on the thing. And for most politicians, you want to stay in power so that you can make changes. So you're caught between these two. But I should add that because our initial focus was on connections, the partners, World Bank, EU, loved it because you can count those things, right? And even when we were first thinking of turning on the hydro dam at Mount Coffee, it was again to increase the number of connections. When we did the growth diagnostic and tried to answer the question, what is the binding constraint to economic growth in Liberia? Then we were forced to confront the idea of power as a productive input for the economy and not simply adding connections. So if you've read some of my pieces and I am criticizing Mission 300 for its focus on connection, is because in my experience, I should add this last piece, was part of the, beyond the growth diagnostic, one of the reasons I began to turn against a focus on connection was initially the support the Liberia Electricity Corporation got from the World Bank was targeted at connecting low-income households. And so you connected more and more low-income households without any increase in demand. And at the end of the month, they were barely using any power at all. But the cost of transmission for the Liberian Electricity Corporation did not decline simply because we are connecting people. And because we had no anchor demands like big hospitals or big hotels. I was thinking hotels or people manufacturing food or even mines. Then it became harder and harder for the state utility to be solvent because it didn't have large off-takers. So on the question of households versus firms, I started off with households. Now I'm firmly in the firms camp.
Moussa, I'd love to have you pick up here and offer your thoughts on if growth is the objective, firms, households, and how do you navigate that in a political environment?
Yeah, so you may recall I did this recording with the World Bank chief economist for the Africa region on some of these issues as it relate to the M300. And, some communication geniuses kind of label it firm versus household, and it's been hanging a little bit on my neck. Although if you follow my logic, that tension emerged. But I don't think that should necessarily be the starting point of the conversation, whether you pick household or firm. So what is the logic? The logic starts very simply with the notion of cost recovery. If these investments are not financially viable, if it's not financially viable, we're going to end up in a ditch. And I think we can get everyone to agree on that it need to be paid for. Now, if it need to be paid for, what is the logical next step? From there, then you will have to some degree, whether it's household or firm, there will have to be some component of productive use, right? I'll get to politicians in a minute. I'll get to politicians. Well, I'm not a politician. So the logical next step is that whether it's household or firm, there had to be some productive use. A household that get connected, there's no problem, but they need to pay the bill. And the bill need to be paid, and they need to increase their consumption over time, and things like that. That's what you expect. So that logic will then lead you naturally to productive entities. And that productive entity, whether it's a household or a firm, again, is irrelevant. The structure of our economies are different, The line between firm and household in many African settings is because there's a lot of home production, that line can be blurred sometimes, but that's not the issue. The issue is you are using electricity, it costs money to generate electricity, you have to be able to pay for it. And as long as that is happening, I don't think we will have a problem, right? So I think that is the logic. Now, I'm not someone who's in an ivory tower and just writing my papers and that's that. I work at the World Bank for some years. I engage with policymakers. I even have a 15-year-old think tank in my own country that I'm very proud of, that I set up, that I'm even no longer involved with, but that is doing serious work and engaging and informing policymakers. I talk to them. Just 3 months ago, I was talking to one of the ministers in West Africa, that is a Minister of Energy. And this logic, he agrees with it 100%. He's like, that makes a lot of sense. But then he's like, but Moussa, your parent in the village, when they see the neighboring village has electricity and their village doesn't have electricity, they come after us during the election and things like that. So that is the politics of it. Now, I don't shy away from engaging with the politics because it's the reality, and the people are living the cost of having those politicians in charge. So we have to also think about that. What is the possible solution? And on the spot right there, we try to reflect. One solution is to say, don't do that. Just be in that moralizing academic recommendation. You should focus on firm and all that. But they are focusing on staying in power first before they can do anything else, right? So I think we also have to think about how to help politicians to balance. And one of the ideas that came up in my conversation with that minister was a suggestion that I made that, okay, these households, especially in rural areas that are poor, they face multiple constraints, right? They face multiple constraints. Electricity is one of them, but clean water is a problem. Education for their kids is a problem. So why don't you approach, even during your election, why don't you approach them with, a menu of services that you are offering? Why don't you offer that, okay, I can do realistically one of two things of this list. If they choose electricity and you have to do it, I have no problem. But if you put it that way, there is a chance that you will have more and more communities that are asking you to prioritize something else rather than electricity, right? So that is just a starting point of a conversation to try to overcome these things. I can't change the politicians, but if I want to change the politician, I need to become politician myself and maybe try to win power, which is something I'm not ready to do yet. But we can think about how to engage to try to move forward. But the framing household versus firm from the get-go can itself be counterproductive, right? The issue is cost recovery. And I think it's very easy to get everyone, even these politicians, to agree that, okay, things need to be paid for. No, I'm not talking, I'm not talking to you. Things need to be paid for. Things need to be paid for, and if things need to be paid for, you need to be generating value, to be adding value, and if you need to be adding value, then you need to do productive use, and that productive use doesn't have to be just firm or household. That's the way I think about it, and I hope that's helpful.
That's incredibly helpful, and thank you also for bringing a practical lens to how to speak to politicians about this issue in a way that moves the conversation forward and has hopefully relevancy to meet multiple ends. We have a fantastic audience here, and I would love to turn to questions from you for our esteemed panel. They have specifically asked for difficult questions, so we are ready. Anyone? Yes, please, sir. Should we take a couple and then? Okay.
Thank you very much, and these are wonderful contributions. But I'm confused because are we talking about electricity as an investment, or are we talking about energy as a public good? Because Africa is not industrialized. Africa is developing. And the moment we start thinking about electricity and energy as a public good, Then we start thinking about affordable electricity, accessible electricity, and reliable electricity. And we cannot start thinking about whether it's politicians who demand it or households who demand it. We know that policies are politics, and politics is development, and development is politics. And therefore, there is a need to start thinking where do we place a balance between political choices that politicians make, and if we allowed them, they'll make populist policies and say, we want to give households electricity. And if we leave it to the bureaucrats, they'll do rational analysis, and rational analysis may not even be pro-poor. It will be pro-business. So how do we ensure the balance between politics and bureaucratic choices? And that's where we fail in Africa. And in fact, a majority of Southeast Asia, if I look at how they dealt with electricity, most of them did it right because they were able to tell us experts off. We know what we are doing, balancing between the two. I think we need to start thinking about electricity that can produce growth that is also equivalent to development. Growth that we have had in Africa in a majority of the times is growth without development. We know that. Thank you.
Thank you. Just from the Ghana case, I'm quite interested to understand. I mean, looking at the country's sort of energy per capita, which is 500, close to that number, it's quite interesting to just hear in terms of what that means from an industrial perspective. And my question is, what's sort of the role of decentralized systems? Because if you're running a smelter industry and you're trying to, if you can't get electricity through connected systems, has there been sort of any reforms when it comes to decentralized systems and the role of private sector in that perspective? Because I think it has quite worked well in other countries where you have either a transmission line independently supplying power to a mining or in a sort of energy intensity industry, just to get an understanding of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we'll do Ken and Marcus, and then we'll take responses and do another round.
Yeah, thank you, panelists. My question is to push back a little bit on Moussa's point that, I hear you saying that we can do both in the sense that we can give the politicians the chance to offer the public the option of choosing power or no power, right? And then the hope there is that often they'll choose the more pressing need, which is getting water, right, beats asking for a power line to get one bulb connection. But we know households will probably sometimes just choose the power because it's a thing of the day, right? And so we're back to square one where the government is still unable to do the balancing. At the same time, policymakers have limited time. And so if their power strategy is maximal connections throughout the country, that's a very different way of spending their time and effort than, thinking about industrial power production, right? So, where the rubber meets the road, what should we give as advice to policymakers? Because, it seems like farms, right, are the ones that will empower households to be able to pay for the power. And so we can't run from this fact that even from the politician's perspective, right, if they're doing both, they'll often concentrate on what wins votes, which is one bulb connections in as many households as possible, and not affordable, reliable power for industrial production. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Ken put it way better than I would have. So I'll just add to that. Moussa, what I heard from Jide is not only do you give them, you sort of maybe make the suboptimal investment by giving it to households instead of firms, but then you're stuck with costs, transmission costs that you can't pay. And so not only are you making a suboptimal investment, but then you're incurring, and Charles knows as well, because Ghana's great at it, you're incurring debt for the next generation because now you're subsidizing it on top of it. So help us get out.
Fantastic questions all. I'm not going to assign them. I'm going to let you each answer the pieces that you'd like. We'll start with you, Charles, and come down the line.
I don't mean to be negative about politicians and so on. No, I like them. I work with them. But I've never seen a group of people. When I was studying economics, there was an area called rational expectations, where people made rational decisions. Then I went back to Ghana, and I saw people making irrational decisions, where you have no power, and yet you have promised millions of people that I'm going to deliver electricity to you when you don't have any. I've never seen a situation where a man says, okay, now I promised the people I'll deliver electricity. So I'm going to sign 20 power contracts, IPP contracts, so we can have so much electricity. And then when he wins power, he signed a contract that says, take or pay. When you take, you will pay. You don't take, you will pay. So you've signed this with all these multinational companies. And then you win, and you are stuck with a bill of $2.something billion because they didn't supply, but your agreement said take or pay. Here again, you have a politician who signs take or pay. If I don't take it, I will pay. If I take it, I would pay. Okay, you're president now, $2.1 billion, pay. Say, I don't have it. This is the Ghana situation. I think Todd has been trying to expose this kind of behaviors, irrational behaviors. But be as it may, our government has managed to borrow money with the help of the World Bank to pay the $2.something billion to providers who never produce. But the contract says they should pay. So it's been done. Now, this is the situation we've had. But as it is now, I think in the case of Ghana, I think the awareness, we see an awareness in the government now that let's put that behind us. Now, going forward, the IPPs that were contracted years ago, some are still remaining, and let us make them deliver. So it looks like we may end up having more IPPs using hydrocarbons, oil, gas to generate electricity. But that should also go to the households for watching the football leagues and so on. And let hydro be used for manufacturing. In fact, that was the initial reasoning for building the hydro dam, which is about, right now, about 1,800 megawatts. The cost of delivery is about 4 cents. Hydrocarbons were paying 11 to 16 cents. And what most of us from industry are saying is, let those who want to watch football and watch General Hospital use the 11 cents, 16 cents power, and let manufacturing, not mining, manufacturing, let them go on the hydro. So these are some of the reforms that we are all pushing for.
Well, that's great, and thank you for bringing in the types of energy and the associated cost and differentiating where they should go. Jude.
Yeah, I think to Ken's point and the first question about this, we cannot get away from this conversation about we have limited resources, finite resources, and we have to choose between firms and households. And what is the appropriate balance? I think it's going to be like the conversations we've been having about growth. In each context, it's going to be context specific and what the political economy permits politicians to be able to accomplish. However, I wanted to point out some of the things that I'm working on now with my colleague Miran at the Energy for Growth Hub. Over the last 3 years, at least 23 African countries have either explicitly banned the export of unprocessed minerals or introduced some restrictions. So whether we like it or not, that conversation is already beginning to happen, right? That if you ban the exports, the most recent was Zimbabwe and lithium, right? Even Liberia has banned the export of unprocessed rubber, so that rubber has to be converted into TSR or something, but it cannot be processed in an unprocessed, cannot be exported in its unprocessed form. It seems as if you're a government and you're making those kinds of policies, you're leaning toward firms. Because to convert minerals into metals, you need significant amounts of power to do that. In China, for example, I spend a significant amount of time in China every year at Tsinghua, and the power pricing favors industry over households. Now, the difference isn't massive, but because it's an export-oriented economy, power for industrial use is significantly cheaper. And so competing, if we're going to do value addition, that's how we have to think about it. So to your question, the problem we've had is to completely define electricity as a social good to be distributed and not a productive input in terms of improving the economy. We have to change that conversation now. However, for me to stand on the stage and make that speech, I have to be elected. I have to be elected, and
But you will change when you get elected.
well, unless I need a second term, so I have to deliver. I'm going to say, like I was telling someone that toward the end of my time in government, one of my proudest moments was the president and I went to a neighborhood that was just quickly. This part of the capital was like George Weah, because he was the opposition then. Like everyone here loved George Weah. Yeah, I think that because he was a great football player, whatever, they loved him. And the goal wasn't to win that neighborhood, but she needed to win that neighborhood to be competitive in Montserrat. The goal was to just fight George Weah to a draw in that neighborhood. And one of the promises she made in that neighborhood was that they were going to be connected to the electricity. So to watch Premier League or whatever. And at the end of her term, when we came to the end of her term, we drove through that neighborhood to say, this was a promise that we made here. Now, we could count those connections. So the goal, to Ken's question, is that we're going to have to find some kind of balance. Now, since African governments seem to be moving in that direction of wanting to add value and move up the value chain of the exports and increase diversity and complexity of the exports, then what we can do in academia is to provide policymakers with optimal choices, give them something to think about. I have read more since I left office than when I was in office. I don't have time to read complex documents when I was in, because you're putting out fires all of the time. So for people who are in that position now, what we can do is to provide them options that they can choose from in making that choice. But whether we like it or not, it seems like they're moving in one direction.
Moussa, a lot for you in those questions too.
Yeah, Judy, I don't know that they're moving in that direction, because what in my reading is that people just think there's no trade-off in life. They're trying to do both. They'd say, we'll do this and we'll do that too, and that one too. And then you just scrutinize it a little bit and you realize that it doesn't add up. And I think that's why, to address both Ken and Marcus's questions, it's not, I was just conveying the way I thought about it on the spot with the politicians who agree with everything we're saying right here, but then say that they won't do it because that might mean that they get out of power, right? Now, what do I do? Crash out of the conversation? No, I'm an academic. I try to think, okay, what could be a suboptimal solution that could get them to do more productive use whilst being stuck in that environment where they agree with me that that's not what they should be doing. They agree. It's not rocket science that things need to be paid for. And that if you're not paying for things, it's going to come and haunt you in the future. Right? There's no point repeating that. In fact, in the recording that I mentioned earlier, Andrew was asking me, okay, what to do. If it's up to me, it's like just let them rot. I said it's economic collapse. That is when people are against the wall, that they're going to make the tough choices when they are confronted maybe with the IMF on their neck and telling them how to live their life for the next 5, 6, 7 years through a program, then they change course, right? That's sort of the way I see it, like personal responsibility approach to it. So we should minimize bailing out as much as possible. And here I'm talking to the World Bank, I'm talking to the IMF, I'm talking to the African Development Bank. Minimize bailing out, let them deal with it because they know what they need to do in order to. So that is the way I will approach it, right? But we are also living in a real life where, you're talking to someone who tells you that that's the reality. Because what I just said here also means what? Like personally, I would rather not be empowered and lie to my people and then go make things worse for 10 years. But that is the reason why I'm not going to be empowered too. But other people want to be empowered and they do what it takes to be empowered. So I think, Ken, you are a political economist. You probably understand this way better than I do. We can be tough in our talk and all that, but the reality is that people are going to suffer. And that's why I was like, okay, maybe a middle ground is like, bring the saliency of all the social services that people care about, put it as a menu of options, and maybe you may have a chance that 30% of them will pick something else instead of electricity, and they will still give you credit. That's just a political economy way of thinking about the problem. Yeah. So that's not like what I will go. That's not my go-to solution. My go-to solution to this issue. So I just wanted to clarify that. Like, it's out of desperation that what could possibly be a middle ground when you're dealing with people like this.
Just a quick point. We did a survey at the IEA in Accra. We were asking people, would you prefer jobs to entertainment? And jobs, would you prefer electricity supplied to manufacturing companies for jobs, or you prefer entertainment and comfort? And most people, about 75 to 80%, said they wanted jobs. So is it because the politicians are not hearing us? Or what is it that makes them do things that, are irrational? But again, maybe Jude is the best to answer this. You being a minister, how did you decide? When most of your people said they wanted jobs, and it is manufacturing that will bring these jobs. Yet, you promise putting on one bulb houses.
Let's go to another round of questions, and Judy can come in on that one. We'll start with a madam here, and then we'll go to the side. Yes, we'll just go along the...
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Dr. Kimaro from Zanzibar Presidential Delivery Bureau. My question is that if you look at the demographics and see how the population is growing, the urbanization, and you see that by 2050, you are going to have more than 60% of people living in urban areas, while at the same time, we are investing on rural electrification. So while the electricity is going to the rural areas and people are going to the urban areas. But the question is, how much do we invest on when we develop the energy blueprints and master plans? You know, you have those World Bank supported and other like government blueprints for 25 years, 50 years. How do we match the energy plans vis-a-vis the development plans that are being developed? He raised a very good question, issue, Charles, about hearing what people are saying. Because when we match these two things, we look at the growth and development of cities. Instead of people coming to big cities, we develop the special economic zones to where the production of raw materials are, and that way you make them still stay where they're staying, you increase the income of the people, but at the same time you make use of the electricity rather than, apart from watching Premier League, they can as well produce, they can as well have power for that, because look at the investment. There is production part that is costly, but there's also the transmission part that is also very expensive. And the cost of transmitting to the rural areas where there is no production, where people are moving to the urban areas, where there's no economic growth in the satellite cities, in the rural areas, in the areas where people live. Because let's give them an incentive. Let's give the young people incentive to stay where they're staying, to stay where they are born. And that's where you'll have even growth across cities, across countries. And then I believe this is the kind of thinking that we're going to have. And then another thing is on the discussion about the clean energy, and looking at hydro production and these other alternative sources of energy, and looking at the cost of using these alternative sources of energy, and how do they fit in within the structures and within the blueprints that we have for energy. This is what we really need to think in the South, in Africa particularly, and see how we can bring about that balance. Looking at the social aspects, there's giving electricity or energy as a public good, but at the same time, making sure that it facilitates and promotes production and investment. Thank you.
We'll start right there and just start with Joe and go. We'll come back around.
Yeah, my question is a simple but important one. So in your respective countries, Ghana, Liberia, Togo, if you had to pick the most affordable next 1,000 megawatts of generation, do you have a guess of what those technologies would look like today and how that mix of technologies might change in 10 years?
Okay. So I think we argued ourselves into a point with no exit on the politics. So it's pretty hard. The politics have their constraints. So are there things we could do, academics, philanthropies, that are take as given the political choices are maybe there's some energy problems that can be solved by more analysis or connections with the right sources of capital, or maybe there are management issues in the distribution companies. Anyway, anything else that's not politics.
Thanks. Arif Mamoon, Chief Economist at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Great panel discussion. Two questions, perhaps touching on something Rafa just mentioned. Thinking of, a lot of the points raised here is about sustainable investments in the energy sector. How do we make it sustainable? In that respect, reflections from your side, either from Liberia or Ghana, and Moussa, your experience in the role of the utility, making them go from being in the red to being in the black, and the regulator's role. Some reflections on that would be helpful. And the second question, perhaps to Moussa, you mentioned trade-offs. One trade-off that comes to mind is, or is there a trade-off between improving reliability versus extending the grid? and offering broader opportunities more broadly. Thanks.
Yeah, and Bill McCraith, I would say, from the private sector. So I just quickly reflect on, the challenge in Africa. A lot of jobs moved into Southeast Asia. A lot of that was driven by a massive differential, about 50 to 1 in labor costs, China versus Europe, UK. So it had a huge advantage to move there. As you now seek to win jobs, your advantage is now far less because you're now competing with Southeast Asia at a much lower rate, so that differential is effectively gone or is much lessened, and energy does become a significantly larger element of the equation as people look for new sources. It's what drove us partly into Ethiopia at 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour in the Hawassa Industrial Park. We were up against places like Kenya at 9+ cents per kilowatt hour. China's typically 15 to 18 in the north, sets the stage. So in a restricted environment, which is what I often hear, there's an available amount of that, and how do I disperse that between it? I think there is that challenge of households versus industry, but when you talk about industry, there's now which industries, and I think that goes to the equation of which industries drive the largest amount of employment for people. And I'd just pick up quickly. So again, I was with Walmart. One of my categories was pots and pans, believe it or not, that I did, and that was primarily done from Thailand. However, Thailand made no ingots. It was the ore came from Australia. It was shipped to the Middle East. Middle East had by far the lowest cost smelting capability. It was smelted. The ingots were sent back to Thailand, where all the big employment came from the making of the pots and pans, the packaging and all that stuff. So it's not possibly about protecting. So this idea of banning mineral exports I think is a false view, as opposed to not losing ownership of that. So I can still maintain ownership, but I can move that stuff to where the lowest smelting cost happens to be in the world, get it back and deploy the energy I have available to the largest kind of employment sector that I can get, and therefore strike that balance. So again, I think the challenge and the question for everyone is, don't just think about the balance between households and industry, it's which industries and which drive the largest employment, because they become the working class, they become the consumer class, that becomes the whole dynamo that gets your country launched.
Connected to a couple of questions that have already been asked, I just wanted to ask for more thoughts on wind and solar. It seems to me that wind and solar are behind where I would expect in Africa, when, given how much the cost has come down, it's under 5% of what it was 15, 20 years ago. And I'm not aware of the raw material inputs being produced in Africa yet, the polysilicon, the monosilicon, the carbon fiber. So just any thoughts about why renewables aren't moving quicker and what we should expect, and why the raw materials aren't here?
I'm going to give the last question to Justice, and then we'll turn to the panel. Right there.
So I joined late, but I couldn't resist to share a few thoughts. I belong to the energy community. I'm very much aligned with a lot of the thoughts, but of late, having been a bit closer to policymakers, I wouldn't say I'm being converted, but I mean, they raise a lot of cogent questions, right? There are a lot of buzzwords we throw out on productive use, but I'm beginning to ask myself, what do we mean exactly by productive use, right? And here's why. So Mr. Mensah talked about manufacturing, but in fact, if you look at the data, manufacturing is almost non-existent in many of African countries, right? And the point I'm trying to say is that I mean, when we say manufacturing, basically we got a service, like a sector also plays an important role, right? And so I'm saying that we shouldn't just target solely as manufacturing per se, but about the productive sectors of an economy, right? Because other than that, we exclude the service sector, which in many of our countries employ a significant number of people. The second point about whether the politicians not people saying they want jobs, but the politicians not giving them the jobs because the politicians cannot give them the jobs. The easiest one they can give them is that electricity. That one they can easily instruct the electricity company to send the electricity there. But promising them the jobs, they have no ways of doing that. I guess the point I'm trying to say is that we stuck in a disequilibrium or like an undesirable equilibrium where the masses really everybody want to sleep in electricity. They want to avoid the mosquitoes, whether we like it or not, right? They've seen the benefits of probably living in a house where there's electricity. You can watch TV, you can do a lot of the things. I think what as intellectuals, probably we should be focusing a lot of our attention now is taking this as given. How can we improve efficiency in the delivery of this, right? Still, generation cost in Africa is still very high in a lot of the instances, right? And Todd has been talking a lot about contract disclosures and all that to make sure that we can't. Perhaps if we want to be more relevant to the politicians, I think we should move towards a bit along that direction. I feel like this idea of we telling them don't give the electricity to this one, we probably convert 10 years from now, we'll be saying the same thing. And by that time, almost every village, every hut in Africa is connected. But the real issues might not be addressed. I still have a lot of things, but I see that she's looking at me, so I'm going to shut up.
She sure is. A wonderful round of questions bringing in the urban versus rural divide, which we hadn't hit on yet. The role of master plans, clean energy, why are our renewables lagging, especially wind and solar? What mix of technologies for the next 1,000 megawatts? What can small donors do that politicians will like or at least not hate? Talking through the utility and regulator roles. Which industries are driving the largest growth here, not just firms, and then within that, what are the productive sectors? A lot here. We have 8 minutes, so 2.5 minutes each. Moussa, I'm going to start with you so that we end with Charles, so if people want to go to lunch. No, just kidding. Moussa.
Yeah, so this is not going to be structured based on the note that I have. So energy plans, vis-a-vis development plan. There's a country that I worked with just 2.5 years ago, and that was precisely the direction they were moving. Move this sectoral plan integrated to the development plan more generally. We work on that. And the political economy stuff that we talked about earlier, it appeared that it was so disappointing to me because we were really inching toward that right direction with things well integrated, but election time was coming, and that was like a 2025 election, and there was this plan with the IMF, and they had to get some fiscal cleanup in order to get this big loan from the IMF. And then electricity costs needed to go up, the prices needed to go up as part of the broader plan, right? But you know what they did? They increased it by first 10% and then 11% on firm industrial part, because they're like, no, election just in a couple of months cannot increase it by a cent for household, right? That's the reality we are living in. I think we have to either abandon or find a way to engage in a productive way. Rural areas, I think we shouldn't think about it the way things are unfolding naturally, because the way things are unfolding, people leaving and going to cities, is endogenous to what is happening in rural areas too, right? And we know electricity, as we talked about earlier, is the biggest fighting chance we could get, but it's still a necessary condition only. So rural areas lack a lot of other things. So if we're thinking about electricity for rural areas, we should think in terms of bundles. And if we don't have that bundle, maybe it doesn't make sense for now, right? And that's the point I will make there. I still have 30 seconds. The next 1,000 megawatt for Togo is buy gas from Nigeria and burn it. So that's straightforward. There was a question about, maybe I'll just touch on the green, right? Here's my general thinking about green. To integrate green energy like solar, wind effectively, you need to have a strong energy system that works first. Like this system that we have that are like old and breaking down, this is not the place to have wind at scale or solar at scale integrated. Even Europeans are like, struggling in some cases to effectively technically deal with the issue. So in the short term, for me, it's like all of the above, starting with the cheapest that will solve our development problems. And then we will get to a place where green will be the best additions. And that's the way I see the transition working for us. But of course, there's a lot of emphasis on that. And in the report that I produced at the World Bank, even back then, I'm kind of proud of myself. I haven't thought about that at that time. Even back then, the ideas we talked about when we spoke about green energy is about thinking about the economy around it, not just importing solar panels that are produced and the jobs created somewhere else, but think about the solar economy, grabbing at least some level of the chain of value, the value addition in that space. And I think that is another way to get the most benefit from the development of green energy going forward. I'm certainly over time, but like.
That was fantastic, Moussa. Thank you.
On the growth of green energy in Africa has been incredible. I think over the last year, almost 15 gigawatts or something thereabouts. It's massive, but it's households and small firms. We don't have utility scale deployment of green energy, and because of that, it's suboptimal. It's not functioning the way it should, but it's giving life to people. And my fear for Mission 300 is, we're going to get to 2030 and they're just going to put solar home systems and be like, we connected 300 million Africans. And so that's an aside. On the question of that sounds like natural resource nationalism. For almost 50 years, we've seen natural resources leave Africa and with 5% royalties. We've seen the benefits accrue elsewhere with very little to African governments. And so part of what drives the banning is that. Secondly, is she talked about the population growth. I mean, the median age across the continent is 19. And that population growth is already baked in because the parents of the future children are already born. Where are they going to work? And so if the only thing you have is some sort of natural resource, then you're thinking about how else can I extract value from this? So maybe sometimes producing the ingot is not the optimal thing to do, but faced with the circumstances you are, that's the first place government start. Maybe we should have a conversation with them about what else can we do. I think generally going forward, I have been thinking with all of this interest in minerals in Africa, maybe there is a possibility here to leverage this interest in African minerals and use it in a way that help build out energy systems in Africa. What we'll focus on is over the last, at least from 2000 to 2015, mines spent about $15 billion generating in self-generation of power, but the power was captive just in the mines. Our hope is that with that structural demand, that it looks like structural demand for African minerals, we can use mines as anchors to build out energy systems that affect the rest of the economy instead of that. And so for us at the Energy for Growth Hub, the benefit we believe we can add to governments is how do you design this if you want to move up the value chain? We're doing case studies in different countries and different minerals about the baseline energy demand if you wanted to add even the most basic value. But how do you design energy systems, or how do you think of energy systems so that it's not just captive power that's used in the mines, but you can leverage mining anchor demand to benefit the rest of the economy? I think this is how we can be useful to policymakers. I think I missed most of your questions.
Charles, the last word to you.
Just quick. Just to follow up on Judith's, in the case of Ghana, we're not just, we have millions and billions of bauxite. So energy allows you to convert bauxite into alumina. So you're adding value from the raw bauxite to alumina. Then energy, again, allows you to convert alumina into aluminium. And you're adding thousands of jobs and values. The third leg, which is from aluminium to car parts, auto parts, aero parts, that's where we are not. And so additional power would help make this happen. Now, in terms of the cheapest power, as you said, I agree the cheapest power should go to the most productive area, most likely manufacturing. Mining, as it is not the most productive area. Mining doesn't employ many people. Mining, you just go downstairs, you dig the gold, you drive straight to the airport, and you carry it away. So if you are asking people to put money into mining, you're throwing your very valuable electricity that you could use to create jobs away. So that is the other one. Short run, or what will attract manufacturing, we're blessed with almost 2,000 megawatts of hydro. It's paid for. The rain comes. The equipment are almost there. So our hydro gives us the cheapest. We have solar. Solar is about 8% of our total makeup of electricity. It's about 8%. We're still pushing for more solar. We have the Bui Dam, which is now trying to put solar panels on the dam to generate more electricity. So the Bui Dam is there. In the long run, our best bet is to develop our nuclear plants. In the long run, a 5,000 mega or 2,000 mega nuclear would give those who want to watch EPL, give them forever time. So we can use our gas, our hydro to cultivate manufacturing that creates jobs. We'll need to study that to find out who is the best or the most productive for us to employ. Is it textiles? Is it a continuation of industrialization? Do we do more? Do we use ingots as inputs for additional production? So for me, and reliability of the grid, our grid is not an issue. Our grid has also been separated from the old electricity corporation. It stands alone as a single company. So our grid is performing well. Our challenge now is, the biggest thing in Ghana now is how do we encourage government and push government towards nuclear generation to help what we have now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope the panel has convinced you of the necessity of energy for growth, but has also left you thinking about the requirement of asking the critical questions of who and where and what type and how is it being used. I know a lot of the questions didn't get answered, and there are more. The panelists will be here all day, so I'm going to invite you to find them during the coffee breaks, but please join me in thanking this panel.